So President Trump making another sharp departure from the Obama era. He met with law enforcement leaders and basically doubled down on his campaign promise to restore federal support for police that was largely withheld, some would say, or the tone was very different in the last administration. Here he is.
We will work every day to remove the gang members, drug dealers, and violent criminals from your communities, and we already are. My highest duty as president is the security of our people, the security of our nation.
Chuck Canterbury is the national president of the Fraternal Order of Police, the nation's largest police union, and he was among the officials who you saw around that table with the president. Good to have you here tonight, Chuck. Welcome. What would you say?
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here. What would you say is the biggest difference that you see under President Trump with regard to these issues?
I think it's the whole tone that he takes, that he wants to support the police officers on the street that have a impact on crime. And he's a true believer that we need to get back to the policing strategies that worked in the 90s when police officers were on their beat. They knew their neighborhoods, but he understands that there's a tremendous staffing problem, but he also wants us to work in a collaborative effort with the federal government instead of a adversarial role that we sometimes saw under the Justice Department with Attorney General Holder. He wants to get into a collaborative type mode, and we're very supportive of that.
So one of the things that's changing is that some of the heavy equipment, some of its military equipment that's no longer used by the military, that was pushed to local law enforcement. And after Ferguson and some of the riots and some of the, the backlash that we saw during that period, the Obama administration clawed back that equipment. They didn't want that on the streets anymore. They thought it presented the wrong front for the local police. That equipment's going to come back. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, do you think?
Well, it's a good thing in many respects. First of all of this equipment is demilitarized. There are no offensive weapons involved. The Humvees and the Bearcats are not armed vehicles. They're armored vehicles. And you could ask the people in San Bernardino, the people that came out of the Pulse Club in Orlando, the people that were saved from the floods in New Orleans 3 or 4 weeks ago, that were saved with this equipment, with equipment that's already been paid for. It saves taxpayers money, it's vital equipment, and it provides that equipment to state and local agencies that couldn't afford it. Right. So it's good equipment.
Chuck Canterbury, thank you very much. Good to have you here tonight, sir. Thanks for coming in. Here now, Gary McCarthy, the former superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, and Dr. Wendy Osefo, who is a professor at Johns Hopkins, University. Good to have both of you here tonight. You've been listening to the debate and the discussion that is going on. Gary, let me start with you. Do you think these policies are going to make the job of police officers across the country easier?
Absolutely, Martha. Unfortunately, there was a lot of political knee-jerk reaction that happened in the last administration, and much of it really to the detriment of law enforcement. I can tell you this, just like Chuck just said, those Bearcats, we used them here in Chicago 2 years ago when we had an active shooter situation. I had a captain who was shot in the head and in the shoulder. Fortunately, he survived. And I also had a detective who was shot in the leg. There was an active scene with a hot zone. We used those armored vehicles to remove people from inside the hot zone. Now, having said that, we all looked at what happened in Ferguson, and certainly I was a very vocal critic of the way it was handled. You don't put SWAT officers on the front line at a protest. You don't put an officer with a rifle up on top of a Bearcat pointing that rifle into a crowd, because we can turn a protest into a riot.
Understood.
It doesn't mean that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. It means that you put standards on how you use it and make sure that they're used in that fashion.
Right.
We need that equipment, especially talking about terrorism, because those guys don't bring 22 revolvers to terrorist incidents.
Let's hear what Dr. Osefo has to say, because you're shaking your head. What are you thinking?
No, what I'm thinking, my first thought is that we are talking about militarization of police officers in our own country. And the truth of the matter is that when you look at the statistics, individuals who are harmed by police officers is 35%. On average, is 35 people who are killed, whereas with police officers, it's only on average 27. So the question is, who are we looking to protect here? And I, too, was also on the ground in Baltimore. I was there during the Baltimore uprising due to the death of Freddie Gray. And quite frankly, when you have military-like equipment, it only agitates the situation. It only makes it worse. And that's not what we want to do.
I just said that.
Obama,
Gary,
what President
Gary just said that.
Exactly, but what President Obama did was he removed this so we could start building relationships with police and the community. So to bring this back out completely negates that.
Here's one of the issues that I want to ask you about, Wendy, before we run out of time. You know, there are a lot of people in places like Chicago and other cities where the crime rate has risen who really are happy that there's an increased law enforcement presence on their streets because there was a pullback. A lot of officers, you know, claim that after the Black Lives Matter movement and after a lot of what happened, which was a horrific situation in many ways, that it made them pull back. That's not good for people who live in these communities. Do you agree?
It's not good for people who live in the community, but in the same respect, the ways in which we stop crime is not to militarize our police, it's to have tougher gun control laws, it's to have jobs for youth. So instead of them picking up a gun, they are able to have a job. In Chicago, it is easier to get a gun than it is to get a job. That should not be the case. We cannot fix broken cities through the implementation of broken national policy. Right, that is just the truth of the matter.
Let me get a last thought from you, Gary. Go ahead.
They're not uprisings. Those were riots.
There were uprisings, Gary.
They were riots.
There were uprisings.
Criminal activity. Criminal activity. Look,
well,
using the equipment doesn't mean that it's being used against civilians. It's being used to protect police officers, which I don't think is a bad thing.
In your own city, Gary, the Department of Justice found that you guys do not have good tactics. They found that you guys resort to deadly violence. And so, quite frankly,
I've already addressed that DOJ report. Don't talk about that.
No,
you actually don't know what you're talking about.
I do know what I'm talking about, Gary. I know that Laquan McDonald was killed.
Gary McCarthy, we got to cut in there because of time, but we'll have you back. Thank you very much. All right.